A third defendant added to the classified documents case. Carlos de Oliveira, who helped Trump's co-defendant Walt Nauta move the boxes. This shows that Jack Smith is not slowing down as he still also pushes forward in the January 6th probe. Joining me now is Maya Wiley, CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and Emily Bazelon, New York Times Magazine legal writer. I want to thank the both of you for joining us. Look, you're getting this news in real time like we are. Maya, I want to start with you. This is pretty big news, in my opinion. I think it's a very big showing from Special Counsel Jack Smith that his investigation has not slowed down, that he's definitely moving forward, making sure if you're not going to cooperate or if you're not going to be a part of this, then you're going to be facing charges. Now, here's the caveat. Maybe he is a cooperator. We don't know yet. But what are your thoughts about the fact that this news has come out that there's a third defendant who's going to be a part of this classified documents case?
I think you said it well, Katie. It's that the work continues and that Jack Smith is leaving no stone unturned and no one with culpability potentially off the hook. So, you know, what's so interesting about Mr. de Oliveira is we know that the special prosecutor had another Trump staff member come to be interviewed, apparently about a call from Mr. de Oliveira about whether or not he had asked for some of the security tape footage to be tampered with that would have been recording the comings and goings of those documents. So we did have some reporting a while back that suggested there was something there. We didn't see that obviously in the indictment that included Mr. Nauta. But I think the real question is, how much is this going to help influence what is already an incredibly strong indictment in terms of the evidence that is already suggested it has, and much more evidence than we're used to seeing in an indictment. So all I can say is buckle up, because it's going to be a ride.
You know, Emily, to you, how important do you think it was to add somebody like Carlos de Oliveira to the equation? To Maya's point, you have a very strong case with even videographic evidence that could corroborate some of the testimony that's been provided either to Special Counsel Jack Smith's team or to the grand jury that's been seated in this case. Do you think somebody like Carlos de Oliveira actually is going to be a critical piece of this puzzle, considering all of the evidence that's been made public thus far?
I mean, prosecutors make their cases as strong and as bulletproof as they can. And so if de Oliveira has evidence about moving the boxes, he also added a lock to one of the doors at Mar-a-Lago. That is important to explaining the story of how these documents were hidden and not turned over to the government. And if he placed a call to an IT specialist right around the time that the government subpoenaed the security footage from Mar-a-Lago, and he was asking questions, perhaps on somebody else's behalf, perhaps on Trump's behalf, about whether it's possible to delete this footage or edit or change it in some way, that would seem highly relevant, especially, obviously, if it ties back to Donald Trump.
Maya, Donald Trump, notoriously known for not keeping notes, meaning we're not texting, he's not emailing, right? How damning do you think it could be to have yet another co-defendant or another defendant added to this classified documents probe that could impute direct admissions or statements made by Donald Trump that could implicate Donald Trump even more so?
Well, very important because, of course, as Emily said, this is a really strong case, but you're always going to build for more. I will just say this. You know, there already is so much evidence in the public record about what Donald Trump said and did, and even his own statements, that were in some instances contradictory. So the question is, I think, whether or not they're going for someone who's going to flip because they have been charged so that they will directly cooperate. Again, I do think that this is a special prosecutor's also shown that he is interested in making sure that justice is done, that the law is served, and it could be that it not only strengthens the case, but it also makes sure to send a signal to others that, look, this is just wrong. Don't do it. Then this is national security at stake. Let's remember that. Some of the secrets that we know that were at risk were things including our own vulnerability to foreign attack. So this is not a small case. It's not a lightweight case. And it's not a case that doesn't have significant consequences for the country. in terms of the exposure that it potentially created for all of us.
Joining in on this conversation is Renato Mariotti, a former federal prosecutor, and Nick Ackerman, former Watergate prosecutor. Renato, I mean, this is not the first time that we see either a superseding indictment or maybe an additional defendant that's added to a pending case. But what does this say to you about the fact that we've got a pending trial date in May of 2024 for Donald Trump and Walt Nauta, and now we interject Carlos de Oliveira, who may actually have some may have a role that's bigger than just being a co-defendant or a defendant. Maybe it's more than just being a witness.
Yeah, when two words really come to mind for me, Katie, and that's Walt Nauta. I really think that this is a lot about putting pressure on Walt Nauta, who is thus far stuck with Trump. There's all this video of him, gallivanting with Trump all around the country in Philadelphia and elsewhere. He appears to be tied at the hip with Trump, and he's represented by a lawyer who's very closely aligned with Trump. They want to put pressure on Nauta because right now, while I agree that the case against Trump is pretty overwhelming, Nauta, that's a different story, and I think they want to make him feel the heat. So I wouldn't be surprised if potentially this new defendant is a flipper, or if the intention is to put pressure on him so he flips. But you're right, Katie, when you mentioned the timeline, because I think that this will impact that and will slow that down. I think that Jack Smith is more worried about putting the pressure on them than he is about the timeline, given that Aileen Cannon is the judge.
So, Nick, my question to you, I am hearing from some sources that it is going to be filed under the same case number as Donald Trump and Walt Nauta's case. To Renato's point, what does that say to you then, Nick? Is this just an additional co-defendant, meaning that perhaps he hasn't had conversations about cooperating? Or is this somebody that could still be identified as a co-defendant in this existing indictment, Nick, but could still be a cooperator?
Well, any of these people, Nauta or this new defendant, could be a cooperator. But the fact of the matter is, putting these two individuals in the same trial with Donald Trump is really a lodestone around Donald Trump's neck. When the jury looks at this, they have to look at the guilt or innocence of these two individuals that were moving boxes to hide them from Trump's lawyer so he wouldn't turn them over pursuant to a grand jury subpoena. That's what the prosecutor wants the jury to focus on. This is the only reason that Donald Trump was indicted in this case, was because he had obstructed justice. He defied the subpoena, and this whole process of moving boxes around is critical. So adding another defendant who is involved in this whole matter just puts the jury's focus on that precise issue, and that's the issue that's going to bring Donald Trump down on this case.
Emily, I wanted to ask, some of the reporting about this guy, Carlos de Oliveira, includes that he was draining the pool at Mar-a-Lago, flooded the room where the computer servers and IT equipment was held. The reporting also includes that nothing got damaged in terms of, not being able to produce information. But how does that actually hurt Carlos de Oliveira in terms of a potential charge of tampering with evidence or, destruction or spoliation of evidence?
If the timing is suggestive, it's at a time when it's becoming clear that the Justice Department is seeking these documents. If there's any text messaging suggesting that this was done on purpose or at someone's direction, all of that could be suggestive. It could be a real problem for de Oliveira and potentially for the co-defendants in the case. Another thing that occurs to me is sometimes you indict someone in order to push them to flip, right? They're facing charges. They have an incentive to testify against someone higher up the food chain. Sometimes you indict someone to give them cover because they want to flip, but they're worried about doing that in the hierarchy they're in. And we just don't know enough, but, it's possible that either of those things could be the case here.
Renato, I wanted to ask you, there's been a lot of hay made over the Evan Corcoran notes and that there should be a pending challenge that we should expect to see from Donald Trump's lawyers in terms of the piercing of the attorney-client privilege that was allowed to occur that resulted in the production of these otherwise privileged notes. The addition of somebody like Carlos de Oliveira to this calculation, Do you think, Renata, that I actually will strengthen Jack Smith's case, even if something happens to the prior ruling about allowing Evan Corcoran's attorney-client privilege notes to be turned over to the prosecution?
For sure. I think that, for Cannon, that is one way in which Cannon can muck up the case, right? By reversing the decision of Judge Howell. Obviously the law enforcement officers were relying in good faith on her ruling, but she could say, I have a different view. I do appreciate, and I agree with Nick's point, that this is really going to change the scope of the trial to some extent. It's going to refocus the jury. Obviously Donald Trump, he has a big personality. He's a big name. He was the president and so on. But at the end of the day, this is about breaking the law. And I think the jury is going to be focused on these very odd activities occurring before a grand jury subpoena. I spend much of my time as a lawyer, Katie, responding to subpoenas and working with my clients in that. There's rarely shenanigans involving the pool or moving boxes around. It's a pretty ordinary course. And so I think that it's going to seem unusual to the jury. And I think the idea potentially could be to have both of these gentlemen, Nauta and now this other defendant, the new defendant, looking at one another, seeing who's going to flip first.